Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the show. As you probably noticed, Britain's in a right old mess. I mean, the problem with just starting with that is there's so many aspects to the mess, the disaster, the cluster, FUCK, that we are currently in. Now, at the beginning of the year, you may remember Rishi Sunak set his government a series of targets, missions. I forget the exact description. One of them was that inflation would be halved by the end of the year. Now, actually, at the time, I think a lot of people thought what he was doing is setting targets that would happen anyway, regardless of what the government did. But then they would take credit for it, and that inflation would come down by half, regardless. That does not look like it's going to happen. Inflation figures today are bad and far stickier, as the word, which is the term which is being bandied around, than in other comparable nations. Now, the problem here is that the Bank of England, which will be setting rates tomorrow, their response to the inflationary pressures, I suppose, that we have, is to hike up interest rates. Now, there's the logic. We'll talk about the logic to that because we're going to take it to pieces today, not through me, but through Richard Murphy, who knows exactly what he's talking about. But why this is a self-inflicted disaster, that this is a catastrophe, that Britain is going potentially to be driven into a recession with all the terrible consequences that brings, without that being the way to bring down inflation. Before we bring in Richard, I mean, I'll put this to him later, but just as an example, this is Jeremy Hunt, who was being interviewed. Jeremy Hunt, I'm afraid to say, is the Chancellor, being interviewed by Ed Conway, who's the economics correspondent for Sky News. So let's just have a listen so we just understand the government positions.
Are you comfortable with the Bank of England doing whatever it takes to bring down inflation, even if that potentially would precipitate that recession that you've almost just avoided?
Yes, because in the end,
even if there's a recession,
inflation is a source of instability. We have to support the Bank of England in the difficult decisions that they take. And what I would say, Ed, is that when the Prime Minister announced that it was his objective to halve inflation in January, there were some people who derided that. They said, well, it's automatic. Inflation's going to come down anyhow. There's nothing automatic about bringing down inflation. It is a big task, but we must deliver it, and we will.
So there we have it. That's Jeremy Hunt's setting out his position there. Now, as many of you will know, the Bank of England is independent. It has been since 1997, but we need to interrogate that just in terms of how government policy interacts with what the Bank of England does and sets out to do. Why is inflation so high compared to other countries? What could actually be done to bring it down? Why is hiking interest rates the wrong way to do it? These are all questions that I would like to know answers to. If you're watching live, do click on, which 99% of you don't, but hello to those who are live. No, click on the YouTube link and press like and subscribe. Do support us on patreon.com/unjust84. We've just restarted these live shows because at the moment we're doing just daily short clips, responses to things, which go very well. But a lot of you we like the interaction, and you get to talk to experts like Richard, and I can put questions to him through Super Chat, for example, to support the show. I will thank everyone at the end who does those Super Chats. That's enough for me. Let's bring in Richard. Hey, Richard, how you doing?
I'm very well, firing on all cylinders. Supercharger turned on.
You always are on all cylinders. I don't think you really need much of an introduction, but you are an accountant, economic justice campaigner, professor at Sheffield University, long-standing, big wig on all things to do with the economy.
I'll take your word for that. I don't feel like a big wig. That's all my own. White it may be, but it's all my own.
Very healthy hair there, I would say, Richard. So just start. Okay, inflation. How would you explain Britain's plight? Because we were supposedly, it was just going to be the inflation was going to peel away. It was going to go down very dramatically this year. So
yeah,
why? Why hasn't it? Because inflation now is it's still over 8%. Why?
Well, I was one of those who thought it would go down pretty much automatically this year because we've got over 500 years of data on inflation, and that shows that inflation always goes away. I have to be clear. Inflation going away does not mean prices fall. It simply means they stop rising. There's big confusion about that. Amongst many people in the economy, they think inflation going away means prices fall. No, it doesn't. That's why people still need wage rises, by the way. But I did think inflation was going to fall because that long-term data shows that inflation always does. What Jeremy Hunt just said, saying you have to take action to get rid of inflation, is just wrong. Eventually it will disappear because the reasons it arose will disappear. What were the reasons for us having inflation? The first one was that we reopened from COVID too quickly. People who had saved during the COVID period, basically those who were better off, went out and spent a lot of money. They tried to buy too many new cars. They tried to buy too many new kitchens. They tried to splash the cash. And there was a supply chain confusion, shortage, disruption, and therefore inflation happened over a short period. All gone. Then we got war in Ukraine, unanticipated, at least by me and I think many others. And that created disruption to oil prices, gas prices, food prices, fertilizer prices, and other prices. And absolutely, prices skyrocketed by May 2022. Since then, most of those prices have returned to pretty much normal, even pre-war prices, on almost everything you look at. If you look at the international trading indexes, those have all come down back to pre-war levels, many to pre-pandemic levels. So we haven't globally got a food price crisis. We haven't got an oil price crisis now of anything like the scale we expected. Gas prices are down massively. So why have we still got inflation? That's a very good question. First of all, we've got inflation because the government tried to stop people getting pay rises. Now, that sounds completely perverse, except it isn't, because people are still pushing for pay rises, and therefore employers are still actually reacting rather slowly to increase their prices to reflect the fact that they're rather late in the day having to give people pay rises to reflect the fact that their cost of living has risen. But most of all, we've got inflation because of Brexit. Because Brexit is now imposing very real and continually rising costs on the economy. We can't get round this, whether you're for or against Brexit. I was a Remainer, but this doesn't make any difference to the analysis. We are still seeing changes which are increasing prices, and those are still progressively coming in. So let's not pretend Brexit was done in 2019 or 2020, as Boris Johnson, remember him, liked to claim. It wasn't done then. The consequences are still flowing through now, and the prices are rising, and hence why we have such large food price increases, which we aren't seeing in continental Europe. It's simply very expensive to bring product into this country now, and people can't pay those prices anymore. You know, tomatoes just aren't to be found for love nor money, it seems to me at the moment, and I like them. And you know, tomatoes is now really expensive. Even the basic brands are really expensive compared to what they were, and this is absolutely a fact of life. And tomatoes are the basis of every pasta dish I ever cook. And this is really worrying. Pasta's gone up in price, and yet wheat prices around the world haven't now. So this is because of Brexit. And then finally, and let's be clear about this, the reason why I think we've got inflation still is that the Bank of England is actually creating it. Now, this is counterintuitive to most economists. I think most economists won't agree with what I'm about to say. But I actually think that putting up interest rates in the way that the Bank of England now is actually in itself creating inflation. And I'll say quite bluntly that I don't think the Bank of England does understand inflation or how it's created in the modern economy, and that they have got all their assumptions wrong. I can remember the 1970s. That's one of the advantages of that grey hair. I was at university in the 70s, and I can remember the economy in the 70s, and that's when we had our last serious bout of inflation. It got to 26%. We're nowhere near that, let's be clear. But this inflation is so different from then. First of all, that inflation did happen because actually wages were going up because we had strong trade unions. Remember that? Well, I do, but they don't happen anymore. And wages were therefore running ahead of prices. And so there was demand-led inflation. And secondly, many prices did not react to inflation. For example, rents. Everybody who was renting in the 1970s was renting from a council. Very few people were renting from private landlords. Well, of course, that's totally different now. People now rent from private landlords. And the moment we have now got an interest rate rise, up goes the rent. And for many people, that's 30 to 40% of their income if they're in rental accommodation. It's also true that interest is reflected in many other prices in a way the Bank of England just doesn't understand. 90% of all cars bought now are on car leases, but a car lease is just a loan by any other name. And of course, if interest rates go up, the price of car leases goes up. If you buy from a large companies are financed by debt. If the interest rate goes up, the company pushes up the price to recover the cost of its extra interest. It wants to still make a profit. The Bank of England just doesn't understand these transmission mechanisms, so that every time they put up interest rate, they push up prices. And in fact, we are now stuck in a vicious cycle, which I think is not being seen in the US. The US has the advantage of having the dollar, a world currency. And it does have the advantage of an economy that does genuinely seem to be growing, where ours is stagnating. And interest rates in Europe, whilst going up, are going up much, much slower than ours are. And the Bank of England is trying to be bold, brash, and, in my opinion, bluntly stupid. And the consequence is that they are pushing up interest rates here far too fast, totally unnecessarily. They can't stop the inflation that we've got by pushing that up, because we haven't got a demand-led inflation. Damn it. I mean, I heard an economist today from a large bank saying, the UK economy is overheating. It's just doing too well. What planet does she live on? Because it isn't the one that I see anywhere I'm going right now. And instead of actually making the situation better by putting up interest rates, by getting rid of inflation, they're actually fueling inflation. It's a bit like Einstein said. This is going to be my last comment before I let you have a word in edgeways, because I'm one of the few people who can actually outspeak you at this rate, Owen. There's not many, but Einstein said that doing the same thing over and over again when it didn't work and hoping the next time it will be different was a definition of insanity. Well, I pretty much think that's a definition of what the Monetary Policy Committee is doing at the moment. It's over and over again increasing interest rates in the hope that next time inflation will come down, and it doesn't, and it won't. I think it should be stopping. I think it should actually put everything on hold. And I think it should, a couple of months' time, give the markets time to adjust, be telling the world, we're going to start bringing interest rates down. That would be...
Well, to be honest with you, your fluency is always appreciated. I mean, I think you might be referring to Karen Ward from JP Morgan, who was on the...
I think so.
So let's actually hear a clip from her. So I'd like your response to this, because here she makes an argument which includes claiming there's a wage price spiral, which I'll let you define. But here's what she has to say.
Our economy is running too hot. Our labour market is still incredibly tight. That is therefore resulting in pay increases, which of course every household out there wants to be compensated for the fact that their cost of living is going up. That's completely understandable. But what happens then is, as a producer, as a firm, you've had your energy bill goes up, then your wage bill goes up, and then you raise your prices again. And that's when you get into this sort of domestic inflation spiral that the Bank of England has to nip in the bud.
So we are then in a price wage spiral as far as you're concerned?
I think there's certainly signs that it's emerging. And the difficulty for the Bank of England, I mean, no one envies them their job at the moment, is they have to therefore create a recession. They have to create uncertainty and frailty, because it's only when companies feel nervous about the future that they will think, well, maybe I won't put through that price rise. Or workers, when they're a little bit less confident about their job, think, oh, I won't push my boss for that higher pay. It's that weakness in activity which eventually gets rid of inflation. Now, of course, none of that's pleasant. And as I say, I really don't envy the job of the Bank of England in being the one who has to cause that weakness. But that is there's no other way around it.
So, yeah, I mean, she makes a kind of various points there. I mean, one of them is what you referred to, that the economy is running too hot. Our growth is actually obviously significantly lower than most major economies. So I'm not quite sure how that works. But yeah, what's your general take on her thesis there about a wage price spiral? That's driving up inflation, and therefore the Bank of England has to act in the way it is.
Isn't it weird that only wages are apparently driving the spiral? How odd is that? I mean, I noticed she's on the Economic Advisory Council. Which Economic Advisory Council? The ones that the Tory appoints amongst their own friends, of course. So let's be clear, she's got a very strong economic bias in her agenda there. And she is a former Bank of England person as well. I'm aware of that. She spent 3 years there, so she buys their agenda. But why choose wages? Because let me, for example, look at a water company. Water companies are allowed to pass on their increased cost of interest to customers in the prices that they charge. A quarter of all the costs of water companies are interest. Wages are much lower. So hang on a minute. We've actually got an interest rate price spiral in the case of water companies, and that's true of many other organizations. And anyway, if we look at wages, the average private sector wage rise at the moment is around 7%, and inflation is running at nearest damn it 9% at the current rate. And the average state sector wage rise is just over 5%, and the inflation is running at 8 to 9%. How is there a wage price spiral when wages are running behind inflation? Actually, there's a downward spiral in real incomes. We've already got what she wants. Wage earners are suffering significant falls in their well-being. That's why they're already living in fear. And she wants to make that fear worse. She's not going to suffer that fear. Let me tell you with absolute confidence that given the job and given the employer she's got, I bet she earns enough to not be a victim of fear as a consequence of any recession that is created by the Bank of England. Does she understand what that fear really means? Does she know what it feels like to think I might lose my home? I might have to move my children from school. Does she understand that what she's actually talking about is the creation of a recession, which means that companies will fail, businesses are going to go, jobs will disappear, we will see blight in our economy, all that because she thinks interest rates will cut inflation. How does she think interest rates will cut inflation anyway? Where is this overheated economy? We're running worse than the US. We're running worse than almost any economy in Europe. We're running worse than the Eastern European states. So where is this heat when nothing works? You started, when you literally introduced this session, you said that nothing works in the economy. It's not going well, is it? And it isn't. I don't know anybody who's turned around saying, God, life's great. Unless you work for JP Morgan, of course, then maybe it is. But otherwise, no, it isn't. And this whole narrative is wrong. There is no wage price spiral. Who says there isn't? The International Monetary Fund says there isn't. And they're a hotbed of international socialism, I can tell you that. I know some people there. They're not a hotbed, but they behave as they are, according to her. Who else says there's no wage price spiral, no evidence of it? The European Central Bank can't find evidence of one. The OECD seems to be struggling to find one anywhere. And there certainly isn't one on the basis of current UK wage data. So that's just technically, I'll use a technical term here. I think it's bullshit. That's the technical term, because I can't find it. It's not there in the data. So what is she actually saying? I'm picking on wages and I'm trying to create a recession. But what's actually happening? There is a reallocation of power in the market. I'm a political economist more than I'm an economist. Political economics is about the relationships of power within the economy and how they influence the distribution of resources. That's what defines political economy. And what we're seeing at the moment is an upward movement in resources. People who work for a living are seeing their incomes fall. People who live off investment income are seeing their incomes rise. We are seeing a redistribution in resources from those who have to work and those who have to borrow to those who don't need to work and those who can afford to actually live on their earned income. It's a great time to retire, by the way, at the moment. The best annuity rate you'll have had for about 20 years at the moment, which is absurd. I mean, the price of not working at the moment is great. If you happen to have got the point where you can afford to retire. Crazy mad that we're penalizing working people to actually reward non-work. And yet that's what she thinks she wants to do. I just don't get it. But most of all, what I don't get is that the Bank of England is deliberately creating a policy of fear. And in my opinion, that's unforgivable. The strategy that I put forward in a blog, in a thread on Twitter this morning was actually what I thought should happen over the next few months. I don't believe you can instantly say, oh, stop, right, we're going to stop increasing interest rates. I've said the Bank of England should do nothing tomorrow. Why do nothing? Because they don't know that their policy is working. I mean, it's obvious they don't know that their policy isn't working because it isn't working. Inflation isn't coming down. So they can't know their policy is working. So they should stop doing anything at the moment and review why their policy isn't working. So they should announce a hold because It isn't working. In a month's time, my suggestion is that they should do two things. One is they should stop the quantitative tightening program. There are too many T's in quantitative tightening for comfort. But it comes out, what it means is that the Bank of England is actually going to take £80 billion out of the economy this year to reduce the amount of money that can flow around that economy and to force up interest rates. That program should stop. They should leave the money in the economy, leave it be. Don't start quantitative easing, just leave everything be again. And then in 2 months' time, my suggestion is they should start to cut rates. Now, the one thing I guarantee is that cutting rates won't give rise to immediate relief either, but nothing's working at present. The one thing I can, however, guarantee about cutting rates is that it will reduce fear, whereas they are increasing fear. Now, why does anybody, Jeremy Hunt clearly wants to do this because he's backing the Bank of England. Why does anybody in politics want to run an agenda of increasing fear in the population, of losing your job, losing your home, losing your children's well-being, losing your business, etc.? Why is that a sensible policy when it's no evidence it works? My policy at least has one great advantage. It will reduce fear, and people who aren't frightened spend money, and when they spend money, we'll get growth, and therefore we'll keep jobs, and there will be a virtuous upward cycle, whereas at present there's a downward cycle.
I mean, on that, because a lot of people are asking, why isn't the government doing emergency programs, relief for those on mortgages who obviously now lots of people, for example, this year on fixed term mortgages, as they come off, their mortgages will go often quite steeply. Why isn't an emergency package? And the response to that has been, well, actually, because that cuts against what the strategy is. Because by definition, the whole argument is you increase interest rates, you suck demand out the economy, and their prices go around. So the whole reason, when people say, well, why aren't they doing help for those with mortgages? Because that's the underlying point, isn't it? They want them to suffer pain because then they won't spend money.
They want to beat us. They want to punish us. Keep on hitting yourselves because that's what you're meant to be suffering. And remember, the Bank of England told us all, don't ask for pay rises. We just heard an economist saying, don't ask for a pay rise. The whole purpose of this is to make sure we don't ask to keep our real incomes up because instead we want the business we work for to make more profit. I mean, there is profiteering in all this too. Let's be clear. Banks are seeing the most massive increases in profits. Energy companies are still seeing massive increases in profits. And some companies in food supply chains are seeing big increases in profits. And nobody is turning around and saying, no economist isn't at the Bank of England isn't saying, oh, there's a profit price spiral. But there is a profit price spiral going on. If we wanted to, I put forward another very simple, straightforward idea the other day on Twitter. The Bank of England, because of increasing interest rates, commercial banks are, because of increasing in Bank of England interest rates, have seen the balances paid to them, the interest paid to them on the funds they hold with the Bank of England, go up from next to nothing 2 years ago to being paid quite probably 5% tomorrow. Now they've got £900 billion on deposit with the Bank of England. That's, by the way, the money created by QE. They didn't deposit money with the Bank of England. The way that technically the QE money works out is that actually money is given to the commercial banks on deposit account. That's the consequence. And they're being paid 5% on that. £45 billion this year, basically gifted to the banks. And we're charging tax on that at 25% or less now. So why don't we charge tax at 90% on that? Now, that's a good way to recover money to help people. If you want to recover money, they're the first and most obvious glaring target. Why aren't we charging an extra tax on banks for profiteering by putting up in mortgage rates as soon as they can, but not paying more to savers? They're not. So why not? Why don't we actually have an excess profits tax on them and oil companies and everybody else? But no, we're not getting anything like a sensible approach to this. Nor are we hearing from Labour, by the way, talking about...
Well, I was going to come on to that.
Nor are we hearing Labour say, let's also tax banks some more either. I mean, again, wrong. So we are really living in this bizarre world where there are things that could be done. But the reality is, and I wrote a paper with David Blanchflower over this year, Danny, as he's commonly known, for those who are you're old enough. Even I don't remember Danny Blanchflower playing for Tottenham, but I remember his reputation. That was before my day of watching football, because it was the early 60s. But anyway, he's called Danny. And Danny was on the Monetary Policy Committee, where he was a complete pain in the backside during the 2008 crisis, because he kept on criticising the other members of the committee. And the point then was that we made was quite simple. The mortgage market is just wrong. If you take out a mortgage for 25 years, you should get a price for 25 years. That's what happens in much of Europe, and that's exactly what happens in the USA. If you get a 2% interest rate in the USA, it's 2% for life, 25% for life. But we don't do that. That's completely unfair. And I get some callous right-wing twits, I use the word callous carefully here, on my blog, who turn up and say, if an idiot took out a mortgage at 2% and didn't understand that the rate could go to 6%, then more fool them. They should pay the price. And if they lose their house, ha, ha, ha. Yeah, oh, thank you so much, the trolls who think this is so clever. No, that's the way we run our system. Our system is wrong. People are being penalized for a system which is designed to profit from them, when actually we shouldn't. We should have the equivalent of Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac in the States, which are there to actually provide state mortgages, guaranteed fixed rate for life. Bizarrely, isn't it, that the states have got guaranteed state-provided mortgages and we don't? You know, the free market center of the world actually has state-run mortgage companies.
On the issue of house prices, since we're talking about that, Jack Elliott asked, curious what Richard thinks regarding when interest rates do go down again, where should they end up in regards to house prices since 2009?
I'm not quite sure how I see the total causality in the question there, but let me explain. Where do I think rates should go down to? As low as possible. I actually think interest rates should always be negative in real terms. The target for inflation is 2%, and therefore the interest rate should be lower. Because people should never have to pay positive interest rates, in my opinion. The moment you have positive interest rates, you're redistributing wealth upwards very definitely by policy all the time. So real interest rates on things like mortgages should be negative, in other words, a bit below the inflation rate, in my opinion. And that's, I believe, the right way to run the economy. And I believe that's the only way in which people can sustain their debts. And they need to sustain their debts to live in their homes. So that's the target for interest rates for me, less than 2%. It's worked. We know it can be done. We know it's deliverable, and we know QE can be used if necessary to deliver that. And QE did not create this problem, although there are people who now claim it. Even the Bank of England aren't stupid enough to claim QE created this problem. And I say even the Bank of England there with some sort of tongue-in-cheek, because they can get most things wrong, but that one I don't think they have. House prices, look, in principle, house prices are obviously far, far too high. Can we, however, see house prices falling without creating a banking crisis? Not heavily. So what do we actually need to do? We need to have a positive round of pay increases above inflation. That's what we need to have. I'm not interested in growth per se. I was having a long conversation with some people last night. I've long been associated with the Green New Deal. We were discussing whether we need growth, degrowth, or whether we need something else. And my argument was we need more pounds in people's pockets with less carbon attached to them. That's not growth. That's actually how do we run an economy with less carbon input and more labor input, so people get more and a bigger share, so that they can afford to afford things like houses. I don't see house prices falling heavily. I think it would be too disruptive to financial markets. I think they could collapse. So instead, and negative equity, by the way, is also really grim. Ask people who were around in the late 80s and early 90s. I thankfully avoided that, but lots of friends did not. They got negative equity, and they were handing their keys back to banks and building societies saying, I can't afford the mortgage for different reasons. Interest rates reached 15%, remember, in 1992. David Cameron was around at the time, in the background, but nonetheless there. We instead need to actually have sensible policies, long-term stable interest rates on mortgages, sensible ratios to income, better for first-term buyers than anybody else, so that there is support. And we need to actually also look at how we tax houses. Houses should eventually be taxed. The increase of the capital gain on houses has to be taxed, even if it's only on death. You have to pay capital gains tax on death, in my opinion, on your lifetime gain on your house. It is ludicrous that I am sitting in a house now, which I frankly, have paid about a quarter of the price of. I've actually paid off the mortgage, but the mortgage was paid on earlier houses, and I sit on this enormous gain. Why? Is that fair? Does that really belong to whoever I give my estate to on death, or should, in fact, a share go to the government? At least a share. Yeah, a share should go to the government. And if we did that, we'd actually create a better, more fluid and lower priced housing market in the long term. So this is a tax on wealth by all means. But, the fact is, when you and your partner and maybe your carer have ceased to need your house, do you know what? It's time to pay tax on it. Not until then, but when that's happened, you don't need a house anymore. Pay tax time.
Another question. David Ratter asked, could the Bank of England be deliberately pushing up inflation? I suppose the point there is the Bank of England has a mandate to keep inflation around 2%, but the argument that you're making is that actually in practical terms, the Bank of England are introducing policies which actually could be pushing up inflation, but that wouldn't be their intention.
It's not their intention. I'm accusing them of stupidity, not malice. I actually think they are being really stupid. They're following policies which are wrong. They don't understand the way the markets work. They admit their models have failed. They've actually had to say our models don't work anymore. They're having to borrow other people's models because their model of inflation fails. Yeah, they didn't even realize that people have fixed rate mortgages. Their model had everybody on variable rate mortgages as if there was an instant impact on everybody. No, folks, that's not the way it works. No, some people are on 10-year mortgages. Lucky people right now. I've got a neighbor who took out a 10-year fixed rate 18 months ago. God, is he a happy chap? Is he a happy chap? He's over the moon about it. He actually asked me about it. I reckon he owes me a pint sometime. But the reality is we have these massive lags, but those lags in the economy as people move off their fixed rate mortgages are ending. And so the climate of fear, which really terrifies me and which apparently economists at the Bank of England and elsewhere want to create, is real now. Very real, very horrible.
Another question, just I think this because it links to Brexit. Tad Campbell, has Richard any thoughts on the current difference between the Northern Ireland and UK economies? And the Northern Irish economy's done better, and that's because it has presumably the single market access we don't, I suppose.
Well, look, Northern Ireland is a difficult place, and I've been doing a little work in Northern Ireland of late, rather quietly. I'm not going to be able to talk about what it is very much because it hasn't been published, and so I can't really mention it in detail. But what I do know about the Northern Ireland economy are a number of things. First of all, some parts of the Northern Ireland economy are doing really badly. Look at the health service. It's in absolute chaos. The absence of government is really not helping in Northern Ireland. It's terrible. And it really is time that the parties manage to get their act together. Well, the DUP manages to get its act together and have a government again, because it's unreasonable to expect civil servants to run the place forever, and it's causing all sorts of problems. But why is Northern Ireland apparently doing better overall than the rest of the UK? Well, that is glaringly obvious as well. They are in the EU, we're not. They've got, I think Rishi Sunak said, they've got the best of all worlds. Do you know what? I'd like that best of all worlds. I'd like to be in the EU because I think that is, for all its failings, and boy, do I know the failings of the EU. I'm not forgiving some of its policies because some of them are pretty horrendous. But bluntly, everybody ignores the Maastricht Agreement now. Nobody thinks that's real anymore. They've all broken the rules. They're not even trying to enforce them. The agricultural policy isn't great, but, overall, Northern Ireland is willing for that reason, but it does need a government. So don't pretend it's a panacea in Northern Ireland at the moment. It isn't.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about is Labour. You brought up Labour. So they are the government in waiting. They could be in government in a year, for all we know. Let's just hear Alison McGovern, who is now prospective. She is an MP. She's just won a selection round, unfortunately beating Mick Whitley, who's on the left. But anyway, here she is on Politics Live.
Would Labour... You said, of course, if there were an election tomorrow and you were to win it, would Labour and should Labour introduce the sort of scheme that Jonathan Gullis is talking about?
It's just as I said before, if we were in government tomorrow, we would stick to our fiscal rules because we can do nothing that adds to the instability that we...
So you wouldn't do anything different at this point?
So that's not what I'm saying.
On that issue, you wouldn't?
So in relation to mortgages and financial products and people's personal financial circumstances, look... 13 years, things have got worse.
What do you think of that? Just that kind of briefly sets out. She's saying we've got to stick by Labour's fiscal rules. Blah, blah, blah. What do you think about all that?
I hate the two words fiscal rules. They are a neoliberal construct designed to limit the size of government and its capacity to intervene in the market. They're based on the idea that money is limited and government can only spend what they call taxpayers' money. I got to share a little secret with you. There's no such thing as taxpayers' money. If you pay little for your groceries, your money has become Lidl's. If you pay the government your taxes, your money is now the government's. It's not yours. They're not your agent. They're nothing to do with it. And what is more, the government actually made the money you paid. Because you try making your own and then paying your taxes in it, they won't be happy. You'll probably be seeing the inside of a prison wall. They make the money. But Labour doesn't recognise that. They don't think that's the case. They think that taxes pay for government services. Again, utter, complete nonsense. Just as banks don't lend out savers' money, and they don't, and that's been agreed by the Bank of England since 2014, the money you save in a bank, if you happen to be in that fortunate position, is not what people borrow. The money that people borrow is newly created money created by banks. Every morning, the government borrows money from the Bank of England and spends it all day. And at the end of the day, it clears it if it wishes to, if it wants to, by borrowing money from savers effectively. There isn't even government borrowing. There's only savings accounts which people decide to deposit with the government. So all of that narrative that she talks about, we can't spend because there's a fiscal rule that says we should not borrow more, is absolute utter nonsense. I mean, the Office for National Statistics put out a tweet today saying for the first time ever, the government debt to GDP ratio has gone over 100%, except they actually put out the same one 3 years ago, and then they recalculated the figures and discovered it hadn't. So it's not the first time they've ever said that. It's actually the second time they've said it since 1961. And the government debt to GDP ratio isn't anyway 100% today, because it's still true that over 800 billion of government debt is owned by the government. And owing yourself money isn't the most difficult position to be in the world. You know, it's like taking money out of your left pocket and putting it in your right pocket. Hey, debt paid. Easy, done. Doesn't matter what the interest rate is because you're paying it to yourself. And the other reason why there isn't that size of debt is that actually there's more than 300 billion included in national debt, which is claimed to be owed by the Bank of England, which just isn't on the Bank of England's balance sheet. It's a made-up number that the ONS make up. It's technically absolutely crap. Crap stands for a completely rubbish approximation to the truth, by the way. It's another technical term. I made up that once, and when sitting, I think, before a parliamentary committee, I was told I wasn't allowed to say crap. So I made up an acronym, but completely rubbish approximation will do. Now, the point is, therefore, that all these claims, fiscal rules, debt ratios, everything else, nonsense. Labour needs to sit down and understand how the economy works. The government makes money. The government taxes to control inflation. The government does not borrow. The government takes deposits. I mean, how do I know that? Well, because all the balances on premium bonds and national savings and investment accounts are part of the national debt. Why do we have to repay those? They're just money saved with the government because people want to save with the government. This narrative about debt is nonsense. So I'm afraid all of this is a right-wing Labour Party buying into the neoliberal narrative that the scope for action that the government has within the economy is limited, and it's limited by the financial markets who won't lend to them, when in fact there is no constraint left from the financial markets. How do I know that? Because QE proved it. If financial markets don't want to lend to the government, that's fine. They don't need to. The government just makes the money itself. When they do want to save money with the government again, let them, at whatever interest rate you like. But the government is in control. And yet there we have Alison McGovern sitting there saying, oh no, we are the victims of the financial markets. No, they're not. It's time we had confident politicians who understood economics, who realized what's going on in the world, who actually could stand up and make a competent economic argument and present it on behalf of Labour so that they could do the job that they need to do, which is it's an old Labour slogan. I think, was it Nye Bevan who first said freedom from fear? I think it might have been. It's what I live by. Freedom from fear is what politics is about. Labour's forgotten. It's time it remembered it. And I'm afraid that is not an encouraging interview to show that that's what Labour will deliver. They're on the side of fear, not on the side of actually working people who need to be free of it.
Just very
terribly worrying.
just very lastly, because we've been very privileged to have so much of your time, but Jack Elliott had a follow-up question, which is what mechanism would have been used to tame housing affordability as per Labour's 2019 commitment to have a housing inflation target?
You can put caps on the amount of money that is available for lending. Whereas in practice, what has happened over the last decade or so is the Tories have pumped money into the economy, hundreds of millions of pounds into the economy, to increase the amount of loan available, funding available for housing, therefore pushing up prices. So you can actually say there's a limit on the amount of money that banks can lend. And if there's a limit on the amount they can lend, there's a limit on the amount that people can pay for houses. It's an automatic follow through. We could put in lending ratios. I mean, I wouldn't make them too harsh, but we can actually say we can't push things beyond the level at which it's reasonable that people can borrow. We need to consider how to do that. We could put in actually something which is much more innovative. We could actually say, well, look, actually, if people can't afford to buy at these prices, then we should have a genuine co-ownership. We, of course, should have more social housing. We should have the government actually taking back into public ownership some of those houses which are going to be made available now because landlords can't make money because the interest rate has gone up. We need to have a broad view. There isn't one answer, in other words. We need a broad housing policy which is deeply imaginative. And that moves from everything from these long-term mortgages to considering credit limits, to considering the amount of money that banks can lend for mortgages as a total, not to any one person, and to how we consider future ownership of social housing should be managed, because we've obviously gone the wrong way. Do we need new housing? Yeah, we need some new housing. It's clear we need some. Do we actually need vast numbers of new housing? Well, we also need to think very carefully how we use housing. There is too much in the way of second homes. There is too much unoccupied space. There are too many homes which aren't in use. It's over a decade since I wrote a policy for the TUC, which was adopted by its General Council in a conference, to say that the council tax on an unoccupied house should, after 6 months, be 10 times the amount on an occupied house, just to force it back into use or into sale. All of these things could actually increase the amount of housing available. And if we did that, we could solve many of these problems. But at the moment, there's plenty of incentive to do nothing, let housing sit empty, and too much incentive for bankers to lend. And the government's been providing the cash to do that. I mean, it is seriously true that of that money that is actually sitting on these central bank reserve accounts, which banks have got, I think 130 billion was provided to them by the government to basically fund additional house loans, which pushed up prices, because that's what the government wants. That's what keeps the chattering classes who vote Tory happy. I haven't been to a dinner party for a long time, but I bet they still talk about house prices. Nobody invites me anymore. Don't know why. It wasn't just COVID, I think. It's maybe because I didn't want to talk about house prices.
We can have a dinner party, Richard, and not talk about house prices. Just very lastly, just because if you have to leave, don't, because you've actually answered at great length about this.
I got about another 5 to 10 minutes before I'm going to go and actually deal with that question of pasta and tomato sauce.
Oh, great. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the very last one, Ian Fresman, the IFS claims taxes fund the government and the BBC supports their view. How can we change the narrative?
Listen to Andy Verity, who works for the BBC. Andy does not agree with that. Andy does the exact opposite. Andy understands that taxes do not fund the government, and he writes some really good threads, and occasionally they let him on Radio 4 and BBC One to actually make the point, but only occasionally, because he's a bit of a naughty boy by saying the opposite. The IFS, Institute for Fiscal Studies, is a deeply neoliberal organisation. Let's first of all say that. Let's secondly say that the IFS says it doesn't do macroeconomics. Now, macroeconomics is the whole issue of the economics of government. The IFS actually is very good at microeconomics. It's absolutely crap at macroeconomics. That word, again, completely rubbish approximation. It doesn't understand it. And yet it willingly talks about something it says it doesn't do. And they shouldn't talk about taxes and how they fund government because they believe in the household analogy. In other words, that government runs the same way as a household. The difference between the government and a household is no household that I know has its own bank, which can create money, which is universally accepted for exchange in the economy, but the government does. The government has its own bank. It is responsible for creating the money we use, and it actually demands that it be used to pay taxes, which is why it's used in the economy. There is nothing which is similar between the economics of a government and the economics of a household, but the IFS doesn't believe that. It believes in macroeconomics, which is based upon microeconomics, and as a result, it talks a load of nonsense.
Absolutely smashed that. The BBC IFS consensus with, of course, the dissenting, courageous voice there, rightly name-checked. Richard, I've been looking through the comments have just been overwhelmingly so grateful for a very, very clear and eloquent description of often very complicated terms and concepts. So thank you for such an incredible education for everyone here. Everyone, obviously, if you're not following Richard Murphy, you're being silly and you need to correct it. So just type in Richard Murphy on Twitter.
Richard J. Murphy on Twitter.
Sorry, Richard J. Murphy on Twitter.
Yeah. Or the Funding the Future blog, please.
Yeah, do that as well. And you'll get all this wisdom all the time, whenever you want it, as events unfold. But honestly, Richard, it's always a pleasure to have you. You've always been, for me, someone I've always relied. I've interviewed Richard for every book I've ever written.
And you appeared on the front cover of my best-selling book, Owen. So this is a mutual fan club.
And it was still best-selling, so that's good luck.
Yeah,
didn't repulse enough people.
Hey, I'll have to come back to you. I've got another book in the offing. You never know. Always. It's all about this stuff. I think we need to have more about this stuff so people really understand the rubbish economics that they're being told all the time. True economics will liberate us and set us free.
Well, it's always an honour to endorse every tome that you write, which are crucial for anyone who wants a different sort of society. Richard, thank you so much, honestly, and take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Enjoy the path as well. See you in a bit. Bye.
Cheers.
Yeah, bye. Brilliant stuff from Richard, as always. Very, very clear and very educational. I think he's educated a whole generation of people on the left on economics, so that's been very, very useful indeed. We've got some interesting. Let's keep talking. I can still talk for a while. I think I probably explained to people the reason this isn't my normal kind of on the run is because I came to Madrid, not on holiday, just for personal reasons. And I am coming back to Britain tomorrow. Everyone hates people who go to Glastonbury if they're not going to Glastonbury. I am going to work. I'm going to be doing sessions with Navarra on masculinity, which I'm chairing. I'm very mask for mask. No, honestly, we'll have a very serious discussion about that with a great panel. And on the police, big fan of the police, always cheering them on. No, we will be talking about the police. So we'll be doing that on, if you look up, we'll be at, if you're there, Shangri-La on Thursday and Friday. 3 p.m, 4 p.m-ish. Unfortunately, clashing with Carly Rae Jepsen, which I'm not happy about. Anyway, I just wanted to let everyone know, if you're at Glastonbury, I will see you there. Will you interview Stephanie Kelton and RFK? Well, for those who don't know, RFK is actually Robert F. Kennedy, who's standing to be President of the United States. RFK Jr., I should say. The original RFK was assassinated in 1968, and unfortunately, I cannot interview him for that reason. But I could try. I mean, it's interesting. Okay, so Robert Kennedy Jr., interesting. I mean, okay, I think I think Joe Biden should have been challenged from the left. I think that would have been very helpful. There's no obvious person to do that. Because Bernie Sanders had ruled himself out, I think partly because of age, partly, to be honest, he has quite a lot of personal loyalty to Joe Biden, whatever you might think of it. I interviewed Bernie Sanders. Do check out the video on my channel a few weeks ago. But anyway, he's ruled out a challenge. There's, for example, another challenger could have been AOC. But AOC would actually only just by about 2 weeks reach the cutoff of 35 years old by the next presidential election in order to be eligible to stand for president of the United States. So in the end, you've got, now Joe Biden, I think some would argue, well, he wasn't as bad as we thought he'd be. And what I think that speaks to is because of the left, the rise of the American left, that shifted the balance of forces within the Democrats and its political center of gravity. And Joe Biden is the sort of Democratic. Oh, hold on. I've just seen my camera has just vanished for no reason. Don't know why that is. So what I'm going to do. Hi, everyone. I'm still here. What we'll do is we will just change the camera over. I don't know why it's done that, though. It doesn't actually make any sense why my camera would suddenly stop. But I am still here. See? Weird. Don't know what happened there. Yeah, so where were we on Joe Biden? Yeah, so you got a shift. The problem was actually, even though you could argue, for example, with the Inflation Reduction Act, you've got some IRA, unfortunate acronym, I suppose, in the British context, is you've got a relatively ambitious set of proposals, but because of the Senate, in which you have two conservative Democrats who basically just try to have the administration over a barrel, you could, I mean, there's still things that need to be heavily critiqued about Joe Biden's administration, of course, but it wasn't like Obama, which actually here, a lot of people around him actually defined themselves against the left. The left became a political force since then, and Joe Biden's not been overtly hostile in the way you might have expected. The problem with Robert Kennedy Jr. is, for one thing, his position on vaccines. He's been, expressing vaccine skepticism, for one thing. I mean, so he's got a kind of, I guess, a kind of a very eccentric platform, because one of, he's been associated with ideas associated with the right, I would say. For example, he spoke about wanting to close the Mexican border. Things like that, accused of spreading right-wing ideas and misinformation. So I think it's unfortunate. I mean, he's, you could say he's emphasizing civil liberties and all the rest of it. The fact he's been challenged, so he's been lauded by many people on the right. A lot of people suggest that actually the role he's playing is to damage Joe Biden in order to make a Donald Trump victory more likely. I mean, you could say Ron DeSantis, but I don't think Ron DeSantis is going to win the Republican nomination. I think that is going to be Donald Trump, and that actually this is just going to end up wherever the ambition of RFK. So the other question there, just linked to that, was about interviewing Stephanie Kelton. So Stephanie Kelton, for those who don't know, is another economist who I actually was in Stockholm with her a few weeks ago. We were speaking, both of us, at a summit organized by a Swedish think tank, Catalyst. And she has a lot of ideas quite similar to Richard, which is modern monetary theory. So you could hear what obviously Richard was talking about in terms of how, kind of, for example, that government spending is not funded by day-to-day taxation, that taxes are a means to control inflation and so on, and that therefore you can invest without in the economy without worrying about constraints imposed by taxes. I'd love to interview her. Yeah, I think she's a very interesting thinker. A huge amount of respect and admiration for her. And I interviewed her. I did an event with her the other week in Stockholm. So yes. Daisy, can we and should we enact a wealth tax? Would it have a higher cost, which is driving money investment out of the UK compared to the revenue? Well, I'm glad you raised this, because I've written this new book, which is, I accept, very overdue, but it will come out next year. So God help me. And it's called The Alternative and How We Build It. I've got an entire chapter on this. Now, some of what I drew from was a proposal. Oh God, was it Dublin University? It was back in 2020, because it was during COVID, and it was some British researchers who came up with. Here we go. I've got it here now. Actually, I can find it. So yeah, the idea would be. Oh no, so this is more recently. But the Wealth Tax Commission. There we go. So look up Wealth Tax Commission. And they were really interesting because they had accountants, very leading accountants, who helped draw it up. They also had someone whose job it is to help the super rich avoid the laws, kind of avoid legally, but to find ways of kind of reducing their tax bill. And that was so important, because what they were trying to do with her expertise is try and work out how you could introduce a wealth tax where the loopholes were shut down. And the best way of doing that is to get someone whose job it is to find those loopholes, and in order to help their wealthy clients. So if you type in Wealth Tax Commission, it's actually ukwealth.tax. And what they did is they did a very, very detailed piece of research. You can read their final report. And it was by Arun Advani, Andy Summers, and then Emma Chamberlain, who's the person I just spoke about. Warwick. So there we go. So Warwick University really drove it. And what they suggested was, they said it was nearly half a century since a wealth tax was last seriously considered. What they did is they commissioned a network of world-leading experts on tax policy to provide the evidence. Their contributors include academics, policymakers, and tax practitioners. And what they suggested, they found a way. What they wanted to do is find a wealth tax which raised a large amount of money, dealt with the obvious pushbacks on issues like if they're cash poor but asset rich, and then you could pay over a certain amount of years, that kind of thing. And what they suggested was that it'd be a one-off wealth tax payable on all individual wealth around above 500,000 and charge it 1% for 5 years. That would raise 260 billion. At a threshold of 2 million, it would raise 80 billion. So they gave different options. But that would be paid by individuals whose total wealth after mortgages and after debts and after splitting the value of shared assets, such as a jointly owned family home, exceeded the threshold, and only on the value of wealth above that threshold. So that they made the point that a wealth tax levied at 1% above £500,000 would require a couple to have net wealth of more than £1 million before any wealth tax would be payable. So it's a very interesting piece of research, which I would commend to the House. Sorry, I sound like a dweeb there. Not for the first time. But anyway, I went into detail in that. I'd written you can't read the book because I haven't published it yet. But that's a big piece of research that I relied on. I interviewed lots of economists and so on. But yeah, it's a very interesting piece of work, which, that's what I would talk about. I need to hurry up because Navarra's on next. And I don't want to get in the way. And also, I need to go back to Britain. And I need to record a couple of videos before I go. So I can do that while I'm at Glastonbury so the channel doesn't suddenly go quiet. What was I going to say? Yeah, the only thing, obviously, the obvious, something that is on my mind, because I've written about it a lot, and that's the submarine, sorry, not the submarine, the submersible, which has gone missing with 5 individuals on it who were taken on this expedition to the wreckage of the Titanic, which obviously sank in 1912 after hitting an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean. And the amount of attention it's attracting compared to the horrific sinking of migrants, of a ship containing hundreds of migrants in the Mediterranean. And I've written about this, the hierarchy of death. The hierarchy of death in which certain lives are valued over others. And I'm afraid to say this whole incident really just exposes that in technicolor. In that, look, I'm not going to, I'm always full of empathy when it comes to the loss of human life in almost all circumstances, unless we're talking about actual monsters, just because these are very, very rich individuals doing something which I would consider myself reckless and deeply reckless. And I think the fact that this company, I think it's coming to light, in terms of how they just avoid regulations and all the rest of it. Clearly, I think it was an extremely reckless thing to do. And obviously, I would never even, if I had that amount of money, I would never dream of doing that myself. But look, live in the current situation, because in theory, they've survived and they're not running out of oxygen. That is a horrible position for them to be in. And I wouldn't, for fate worse than death, to know that you're in that position. But what on earth, actually? What on earth? Let me just stop skipping around this, okay? Hundreds of people, human beings, with hopes and dreams and fears, have died in horrific circumstances. And they've died in horrific circumstances. Let me make this clear, because, with the European Union, a campaign to remain, despite the problems I have in its current form. But EU policy, in terms of turning the EU into a fortress Europe, is at the root of this. That is, in my view, I would consider that social murder. The mass deaths of overwhelmingly people from Pakistan, and their lives have not been given anywhere near the weight of 5 very rich individuals who made not to blame them for the circumstances they're now in, and I hope they are found safe, but who threw a huge amount of money into a very reckless leisure activity. The amount of focus shows the dehumanization of migrants, of refugees, of people in the most desperate circumstances on earth, and how little their lives are valued. And it is such an instructive example. And historians, I think, will write about this. You can imagine this as the opening of a book, you know, which tells the tale of two different sinkings at the same time. And how much attention, you know, the president of the United States, the king of Britain, getting hourly updates on this. You know, the most important story on the face of the earth. I know it has its appeal, the Hollywood shtick about it, though I do think it's torture porn, because I think the odds, from what I've read from experts, of A, it being found even if they are still alive, and B, if it's on the bed of the ocean, being able to extract it, are actually very, very low. It's actually very, very difficult to do that. And therefore, are we just indulging this kind of countdown when actually the odds of them ever being found alive are actually very, very low? So it just comes across as kind of macabre torture porn. But we can see here in Technicolor how people have been dehumanized and how we focus on the weight of people who are rich, who are white. Not everyone in that submersible is, but 3 of them are. One of them is British. The focus on them at the exclusion of hundreds of people, including huge numbers of children who have died in the most horrific circumstances. We're getting the names of those 5 rich individuals all over our TV screens, all over the internet. Not a single person on earth, almost, apart from their loved ones. Sorry, that's not true. The loved ones know their names of those who've died. But the vast majority of people on earth will never know a single name of a single person who drowned in horrific circumstances in the Mediterranean. So yeah, anyway, I better go. I'm going to leave you all to go and watch Novara now. I will be back next Wednesday. I'll be back in Britain, which is nice. I'm looking forward to be back home, to be honest. I'll got lots of videos coming up and interviews as well. Much easier now when I'm back in Britain. The camera did die, which is probably Michael Walker, who I'm going to see tomorrow. I'll be camping right next to him. We'll be camping buddies. And we will be, me and Michael Walker will be doing events together in Glastonbury and thoroughly disgracing ourselves. But I am looking forward to see my wonderful compañero. Thank you to Jack Elliott, Tad Campwell, David Browater, Jack Elliott, Robert, Ian Trensman, Days of End for your contributions on Super Chat. Do press like and hit subscribe. Do support us on patreon.com/SimonJones84 if you can. It is a very difficult time, but we will be doing, coming up, in fact, now we're booking a Conservative Party conference and Labour Party conference. Our videos every year, we do those. And we've got, Dali's presenting today in Novara anyway, if someone's pointed out. I love Dali as well. Dali, a big fan. Don't think she's going to be at Glastonbury, but I will be getting the train with the Novara's wonderful producer, Gary, tomorrow. All right, that's enough for me. I better go and finish some work. Lots of love, everyone. I hope you're doing very well. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for Richard, who is brilliant as ever. I will see you all in a bit.